Okay, so I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and turn it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves. My name is Kate Royard. I am a director at Temple Scott Associates. I've had the pleasure of working with the team at CSMB for the last year or so, just to help enhance CSMB's advocacy, specifically in Ottawa at the federal level. I'm joined by my colleague, Don. I'll pass it over to you, Don.
Good afternoon, everyone. Don Moores. I'm the president of Temple Scott Associates. I work closely with Kate and have worked with CSMB on a number of advocacy initiatives and very much looking forward to today.
Yeah, I guess that's me then, in the order of how the events are. So I'm Hans-Joachim Wieden. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba, here in Manitoba, I guess. And I'm also the president of the CSMB and the chair of the Advocacy Committee. And, you know, this is an effort that we put on to provide the community that we are representing to be equipped with the tools and seeing what's out there and what's going on in Ottawa. And it's highly aligned with the focus that our society has on providing advocacy for the molecular life sciences. And then hand it over to Vali.
Thanks. So Walid Houri, I'm currently the vice president of CSMB. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, and I've been working with AJ, the rest of the CSMB exec, as well as with Temple Scott, Kate, and Don, on different aspects that CSMB is interested in. And in this respect, we're very much interested in advocacy. So it has been a very fruitful collaboration with Temple Scott, and I look forward to this session.
Thanks. And just before we get into the contents, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. If ever you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. If we don't get to them right away, we certainly will leave time afterwards to get to them. Another thing that I want to mention is that this will last about an hour. If for those of you who might want to stick on and ask more questions, if it goes beyond an hour, I will stay on, but this session itself will last about 1 hour. One more thing, si jamais vous préférez poser vos questions en français, il me fera plaisir de vous répondre en français. So just FYI, don't be shy. And with that, I will get into the content. So today we're going to look at a few things. We're going to talk about lobbying 101. What does it mean when you have lobbyists working for you? How is lobbying work as a tool, as a function of advocacy? We're also going to look at how science research is funded in Canada, specifically at the federal level. We're going to get into some of the specifics of what the CSMB is advocating for in Ottawa, and happy to answer any questions you might have about that. We're also going to look at how CSMB members and broader members of the community can enhance CSMB's advocacy. We're going to look at election preparedness, so things like in the context of a potential election around the corner, how might CSMB members be able to engage with potential candidates? What could that look like? And then we're going to get into a Q&A and have a little bit more of an open discussion. So as mentioned, feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A. So first of all, we're going to get into, lobbying as a tool for advocacy. When we're talking about the foundations of advocacy, yes, lobbying is a part of advocacy, and it's a very legitimate act. And the reason for that is because, quite frankly, governments are not the experts in everything. They need to be speaking and communicating with experts in particular fields to better understand the context, to better understand the impact of their decisions. For instance, not everyone who's making this policy decisions about scientific research is necessarily a scientist or a researcher themselves. So it is absolutely critical that there is a flow of communication between political decision makers, anyone involved in the policymaking process, and the experts in the fields themselves. And CSMB has the mandate and is a voice in Ottawa on behalf of the community. And another thing that I want to mention is that, you know, not only can individuals and associations, not-for-profits, companies, coalitions be communicating directly with elected officials like members of parliament or senators, they can also be communicating with civil service. So people that occupy important roles in government that are not necessarily elected. So things like deputy ministers or, you know, program managers, positions that are not elected, but nevertheless are very impactful. So CSMB is in Ottawa communicating with both elected and non-elected decision makers. So when we're talking about lobbying, we tend to abide by 6 very key principles. And that is aligning your issues. And when we say align your issues, what that means essentially is to position your advocacy, position any policy recommendation that you have in the context of existing government priorities. And, you know, if we want to think about economic resilience, for instance, as a priority for any government, then we can talk about how, or we can align or ask about how enhancing and reinforcing scientific research in Canada is in fact a tool to safeguarding economic resilience. So that's an example of just positioning your advocacy ask in the context of a government priority. Another principle that is important to understand is, you know, understanding the decision-making context, taking stock of, you know, where decisions are made, understanding the parliamentary process, understanding what instances throughout a parliamentary session, where will I have the opportunity, or where will my organization have the opportunity to weigh in on certain topics. This is something that CSMB certainly does, whether it's at the committee level or otherwise. Number 3 is to really prioritize your advocacy issues. The federal government deals with lots and lots and lots of stakeholders and hear lots of policy recommendations. So it's really important to be able to distill an organization's specific policy recommendations, and instead of having 20 or 30 different ideas, to really be able to distill it down to 3 or 4 concise, realistic policy recommendations. And again, that is something that CSMB has been able to do. Forming alliances and cultivating third-party support. So again, the more voices saying the same thing, the better. And in the context of scientific research, you know, there is a lot of aligned support and a lot of voices saying very similar things, and we can get into that a little bit later. Number 5 is persistence pays off. So in the world of lobbying, especially at the federal level, it's a little bit of a long game. Decisions don't get made all that quickly, often. But sometimes, you know, once you keep keep voicing the same thing and continuing on with your advocacy, eventually the message starts to sink in, and that is something that we see in the world of lobbying. Sometimes it takes a while, but persistence does pay off, and we see that all the time. And number 6 is interesting, is keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So what that I mean by that is, it's great to have alliances. It's great to have third-party support. If you know that there are stakeholders in the broader science community that is saying the same thing as you, great. But it's also important to know if there are other voices that are saying do not agree with you, and keeping tabs on that as well. I will say, in the context of CSMB, there isn't a whole lot of enemies. You know, there's not a whole lot of voices saying things that are against what CSMB is proposing. But in general, I do like to keep it as a principle of lobbying. It's good to know who your supporters are. It's good to know who might be saying things that are not aligned with you as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at tactics for advocacy. So there are different ways that you can, or that your organization or as an individual, that you can participate in advocating at the federal level. And, you know, the most obvious one is just through direct engagement, direct meeting programs. Over the course of the year, representatives at CSMB will meet with key decision makers in Ottawa or around the country, but a lot of them are based in Ottawa. And we'll have just direct engagements, planned meetings with an agenda. And, you know, that is an effective way to make sure that concerns are being heard with the right people. And that is something that we at TSA help align for CSMB, and CSMB does a great job in presenting and discussing those issues in those meetings. Next is, you know, there's various, I had mentioned this earlier, there's various opportunities to engage via parliamentary processes. So for instance, over the course of the summer, CSMB had presented their recommendations in advance of the next federal budget. This is an official process. It's open to stakeholders. It gives stakeholders the opportunity to submit their policy recommendations as the federal government thinks about what they're going to put in its budget. And there's a few different examples of other committees that conduct studies, whether it's on you know, the Science and Research Committee this year had conducted a study on the role that scholarships and grants play. CSMB participated in that as well. So there are sometimes these official opportunities that allow stakeholders to engage directly on a specific topic. Next, we have external advocacy. So when we're talking about that, talking about using pressure from outside resources and coalitions to enhance messaging. And again, CSMB, I had mentioned this before, they're not the only, there's other voices that are saying very similar things, especially in the research community. So being able to leverage broader coalitions is very useful in sort of turning the volume up on any given policy recommendation. And then next is grassroots engagement. And when we're talking about grassroots engagement, that's when we're really talking about, you know, mobilizing at the citizen level on a specific topic or policy recommendation. with local MPs. So next we're going to talk about how science gets funded in Canada. And I'm sure most of the people in this webinar, is aware of tri-agency funding. So the major federal research funding agencies, these really represent the backbone of the federal research funding ecosystem. So we have NSERC, which supports natural sciences and engineering, CIHR, which is responsible mostly for health funding, SHRC, which supports more the sciences and humanities. And generally, all of these major agencies are funded via allocations that are stipulated in the federal budget, which is developed annually. A few other sources of funding for science research in Canada is the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, the Strategic Science Fund. So the Strategic Science Fund, for instance, will fund third-party research organizations. In fact, the SSF made a big announcement yesterday about funding some third-party organizations like, for instance, MyTax, Genome Canada. These are the types of organizations that the SSF funds. And then in addition to federal sources of funding, there are also provincial and territorial sources. That being said, they obviously vary from province to province, and they are operating with less of a budget than the federal government. I'll pause there and I'll ask if any of my colleagues, HJ, Don, or Wally, want to weigh in on any of this part about how science gets funded in Canada. All good?
So, well, actually, I probably can say something to this, and I would like to ask Don maybe about just to speak a bit about how the critical component here is, for instance, to understand where how the budget is allocated to the different funding venues. I think that's an important piece. I mean, these funding bodies do exist, and they're distributed funds that are allocated to them. But on the government level, on the advocacy level, I think it's an important piece to provide recommendations to the government how to actually resource those funding agencies, right? And that's something where, we as scientists have to participate in that. And so maybe you can speak a little bit how the information flows going from a mandate letter to ultimately getting the money into the funds into the funding institutions.
Yeah, thanks, HJ. I mean, it's a pretty, I'll start off by saying CIHR, the Tri-Council granting agencies, CFI, they have what are known in town as A-base budgets. So they have base levels of funding that they receive year after year, absent a decision by the executive branch to change that. We're actually going through a program review right now, which resulted, for example, in the CBC making some fairly high-profile cuts this past week. And I would expect that each of these agencies are also being asked to return part of their A-base funding as part of the government's program review. In addition to that, through advocacy at the political level of government, the executive branch, cabinet ministers, you can encourage the annual budget exercise where the government announces priority new fiscal expenditures to devote additional either permanent or one-off budget envelopes to some of these agencies, right? So the Naylor report would have been a good example of that. And the 2018 budget, I believe, that actually permanently increased, not to the level that we wanted to have seen, but the funding for CIHR, for NSERC, and SHRC. And so through the annual budget making exercise at the federal level, that's usually in April, or through election campaigns that we're coming to, there are many ways to highlight the need for the federal government to invest in science and research. And coming back to Kate's point, by aligning what we want, more investment in science and research, with some of what the government's overarching goals are, like promoting innovation, like retaining skilled labor, like attracting skilled talent, global talent, these types of things. So it's about aligning your message, which was the first of the 6, in terms of advocating for what we want in a way that also convinces the party that we're advocating to, or the government, or the member of parliament, that what we want aligns with what their policy objectives are as well.
Thanks, Don. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over, when we have a sense of how science gets funded, some of the basics of lobbying, some of the tactics of lobbying. But if we want to look at more into the specifics of what it is exactly CSMB is advocating for, I mean, we did outline it already. We're a very vocal advocate of enhanced and predictable funding. But I will turn it over to HJ and Waleed to maybe speak about a little bit more of the specifics when it comes to your recommendations when you're speaking to government, or when you're speaking to decision makers in Ottawa.
I can, yeah, do you want me to start, Waleed? So I can maybe kick this off a little bit and then hand it over to you, Waleed, afterwards. So one of the, I mean, we were just talking about the fact that we have to increase the funding to research and science and whatnot. And that is an argument that, and I think that we'll touch on how one has to have a narrative that is consistent over a while, is that we're trying to support the research endeavor or the research ecosystem in Canada. And one of the issues that, as Don pointed out, in the 2018s, we were actually aligning our ask with the date, with the in the following years with the Naylor report, for instance, in terms of like we need to have increased funding to the funding bodies to make sure that the Canadian science enterprise is still competitive within the other industry nations that we're actually competing with. And that conversation we had with a lot of people at different levels. We met with senators about this, we met with deputy ministers, we met with people from our local ridings. And so the narrative was on all levels of the government, and the narrative was the same, and we tried to align this. And so as a response, funding was increased to the tri-council agencies, for instance. And then the next step where we thought, we identified the problem in this was that graduate student funding is an issue. So we aligned our ask with the graduate student funding issue and went and talked about how important it is to have consistent funding and appropriate funding for graduate students, that they are not coming into this by living for like 5 years under the poverty line. And you might have seen, some of you might have seen the publication that the Ottawa Science Network put on through one of the journals that are the journals of CSMB, the Biochemistry and Cell Biology Journal, which is a Canadian journal that published basically the survey that was put on by them with respect to the graduate student funding. And that's a narrative that we have been talking as well. And, we have seen increases and appreciation about the need to increase funding to the to graduate student program. But but based on these two major steps and stories that we have told over the last couple of years, our current narrative is aligned with the previous two ones in a way that we're trying to get them to communicate to the different levels of government that science and research as itself has to become a desirable career path. And part of that is everything we have said before: predictable funding, predictable scholarships, and the ability to actually migrate through this and identify this. And I think there is a lot of positive response. So for instance, we talked to the chief science advisor to Canada, Mona Nema, earlier this year about this issue, and we had a very interesting discussion with respect to this. We also attended, Waleed and myself, we went to the CSBC meeting in Ottawa in November, where we met a lot of decision makers and people from funding agencies to actually socialize our ideas. And maybe, Waleed, you can talk to that experience a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. So it's been a very eye-opening experience, actually, for me being involved in this activity. And it's the ask that we always tell the MPs, MPPs, chief of staff of ministers, is that we want to increase the funding. We are asking for an increase in funding for graduate students fellowships as well as postdoctoral fellowships, at least to match with inflation. But we're also asking an increase of, let's say, 10% per year over the next 5 years, and for the funding agencies, so that at least we in Canada be competitive with what's happening in other G7 countries. And it is interesting talking to these different representatives from the government, because basically some of them, when you talk to, are familiar with the scientific funding in Canada, with the science funding in Canada, but others are actually not so familiar. So part of the discussion with these government representatives is actually an educational component to it, because basically you have to tell them this is how science is being funded in Canada, and some of them don't know how this is happening and why is this important. So the other thing is that to highlight in our discussions is the fact that funding for basic research, which is basically what most CSMB members are doing, is important for Canadian economy, because if you don't fund the basic research, you don't get the expertise in our economy, and therefore you lose that expertise, which many of us, I think, have encountered. Many of our students, many of our postdocs end up, for example, in the States or Europe. So that's another angle that you could use, that we do use in our discussions with the officials, because we tell them actually there's an economic impact on science funding in Canada, or lack of science funding in Canada. So that's a very, so university research actually drives the economy as well. So this is something we also address, and in advocating for science funding, there's specific goals that we're after. Of course, you go after the 10% increase every year, but whether that happens or not, as Kate, Don, and AJ mentioned, that you just have to keep at it, basically, and hopefully something filters and something goes through the filters within government, so that you have some sense that there's someone listening at the end of the line. So this has been a very interesting experience, and I urge everyone basically to be part of it, to push this importance of why science is important, not just because it's important from gain of knowledge, but actually there's a direct economic benefit for funding of science in Canada. So back to you, Kate. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. So that's a good lead into our next slide, which is, talking about grassroots engagement. And yes, we have the CSMB team advocating on people's behalf in Ottawa, but can individual members engage in lobbying efforts themselves and advocacy efforts themselves? And the answer to that is yes. Earlier in the presentation, I talked about different tactics, one of which is grassroots engagement. So, as I had mentioned, the more voices saying the same thing, the better. And as individuals, you all have an MP that is your representative. And quite frankly, MPs do have a hard time saying no to meeting requests from their own constituents, because they do rely on their constituents to vote for them. So if ever you feel compelled to reach out to your local MP office, you are certainly well within your right to do so. You can reach out via email, you can call the constituency office, you can request, just a brief meeting, either at their constituency office in the local riding, or virtually. MPs pretty used to both. And you're very welcome to sit down and chat with them and talk about some of the issues that are top of mind from your perspective. And I certainly encourage you to reach out to your partners at CSMB who would be more than happy to provide you with resources on, how to draft a meeting request. What are the specific policy recommendations that we have been advocating for? What is the rationale behind them? You're certainly welcome to reach out to your partners at CSMB and definitely there's nothing preventing you from connecting with your local MPs. And I will say that, although CSMB does organize lots of meetings with non-elected officials as well, I will say that on an individual basis, non-elected officials, like assistant deputy ministers, etc., are less likely to meet with individuals as opposed to organizations. That being said, if you're participating at a summit or a conference and there are non-elected officials there, feel free to table the same policy recommendations that you might have tabled with your local MP or another elected official. And then, so we're going to get into, okay, what are the basics of an effective meeting? So, MPs, for instance, meet with a lot of stakeholders. Typically, meetings do not go more than 30 minutes. If you're lucky, sometimes they're even cut shorter. So you got to make sure you go into a meeting with a good structure in mind. And you have to make sure, that they're aware of, the organization that you're a part of. In this case, a lot would be members of CSMB. Make sure that they are aware of the work CSMB does. Make your recommendation very clear and concise. Like I said, MPs talk to a lot of stakeholders and get a lot of recommendations. So being able to distill your ideas and having very concrete, actionable recommendations that they can then take to their broader caucus members is very practical. And then the next two, so support and action, is, make sure to ask for the policymakers' support in what you're saying. Next, we're going to get into election preparedness, and we're going to look at election cycles. So as we had mentioned earlier, we are probably not very far away from another federal election, which gives stakeholders an opportunity to turn up the volume a little bit on some advocacy asks. With this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dawn, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Kate. So yeah, just very quickly, obviously during an election campaign, this is probably a time when members of parliament and potential members of parliament are most attentive to their constituent issues, because of course it's very close to the date on which they are asking their constituents to vote for them. So we work with a lot of clients who have membership or supporters across the country to engage in some sort of election advocacy campaign. It's a good time to raise profile, to educate, and to also precondition for potential future members of parliament for priorities for science and research. So normally it's fairly straightforward now with our fixed federal election dates as to when an election might be. And the next election has to happen on or before October 21st, 2025. We are in a minority parliament, however, so it is a little bit more murky, as Kate referred to. Early dissolution of parliament is quite possible, and I would argue probable. It will essentially be determined by likely one of the Liberals or NDP, because of course they signed a supply and confidence agreement in March 2022, I believe, which outlined that the NDP would support the Liberal government through a number of confidence votes in exchange for progress on some policy priorities, including most notably a national dental care program. So if you want to try to handicap when an election might be, well, it'll be when it's in the strategic interest of either the NDP or the Liberals to pull out of that agreement. The agreement says that they'll cooperate until October 2025, but it's not binding. So if you are a poker player or a game theory player, you just say, well, one of these two parties, when are they going to end it? It's when they have the chances of most likelihood of success in the next election. Right now, if you look at the polls, neither have much likelihood of success in the next election. So I would argue that that means, at least in the short term, there is very unlikely to be an election. However, of course, at some point, if you play game theory out, there might be a point where this is the best chances they would have. It's not going to get much better. And so you can look at the fall of this next year, 2024, spring of 2025 as possible election dates. So in the run-up to an election campaign, sorry, next slide, Kate. Coming back to Kate's point about trying to align your messages, there are a number of ways to raise the profile of CSMB, of science and research, with potential candidates for office. And there are a number of forms for doing that. So we have 6 sort of themes that we think are likely to be included in most party platforms based on sort of long-standing policy priorities. So issues like crisis preparedness and harking back to the COVID-19 pandemic, there's definitely a role for supporting science and research that's tied to that. Economic resilience, which we've already touched on. International competitiveness, how are we going to retain and attract the best and brightest? Innovation, talent retention. So these are some of the themes or opportunities or questions that you can ask as a way to build support for what we're trying to do and hopefully elicit commitments and discussions amongst topics that we want to have. It's not just when they knock on your doors, although that's a good opportunity when they're specifically coming to your door to ask for your support, to ask these types of questions. Most candidates for office would have a website or social media account, so you could email them these types of questions. You could send them a direct message on Twitter. Twitter is usually formerly known as Twitter, is the social media platform that a lot of political discussion happens on, although increasingly Facebook and Instagram would be vehicles as well, or at all candidates debate. These are all opportunities to kind of ask these types of questions, build awareness for the importance of science and research within communities across Canada, not just as an Ottawa bubble type discussion, and begin to link our priorities with some of the priorities that we think are going to be in party platforms.
Thanks, Don. There's one thing that I wanted to go back to on this slide is when we're talking about the potential dissolution of Parliament. A big policy discussion always happens around the budget. So, for instance, in order for something that could spark an election is when there is not majority confidence in the House on a policy issue like the federal budget. And the federal budget is always tabled in and around the same time, end of March, early to mid-April. And in minority situations, like the one we're in, sometimes budgets can almost be like mini platforms almost. So we'll certainly keep CSMB members appraised on everything that is in the federal budget. I know that we always do, but it is one of the more impactful pieces of legislation, one of the most impactful pieces of legislation that is tabled on an annual basis. And then with that, I mean, I know that we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so we certainly look forward to getting to those. But I will end it here. I can pass it over to HJ and Waleed just for some closing remarks, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate, for the run through the initiatives here. And I just wanted to echo the fact, and kind of leads over to a question and answer period, I guess, is that it's important that we are also working on the riding level and on the local MPs level, because we have, in the conversation that we had before with members of the parliament and with senators, there can be great champions for your cause. And so if you convince them, they can, I mean, we had cases where they would just go and ask a question on behalf of the CSMB in the parliament to actually have a justification or something like that. These are great stories to have. And these are done, and what we have learned from them, these are done basically by having a member of the parliament or somebody in a riding to understand by what CSMB or what you're asking is important for that riding. And that can be done best on that riding level. And so they need examples to tell the stories, kind of thing. So they need to know when your grandma stands up and says, you know, my son is like, you know, does not eat anything because he's going to grad school, or because his GPA was only 3.5, but he holds 2 patents but has no money. That's a story that will make it, for instance. You know what I'm saying? But that's done, and it's, I mean, we cannot, as the advocacy committee, we don't know all of these kind of things. In connection with that is, so the CSMB has participations through at-large members in everything we are doing, including the advocacy committee. And we have some sort of an ambassador program where, you know, if we know that a certain engagement occurs in a certain location, we can actually relay that to members of the advocacy committee or of the society that wants to be part of that. So we can actually help you to find places to talk to, or individuals to talk to. So, so please consider getting engaged with us through an at-large role, for instance. I mean, I'm not asking for the membership here, but assuming that you are a member already. But we always look for at-large members to actually go to the program. And if you don't feel that you're ready yet to do the engagement on your level, join one of our committees and we'll train you on the go, so you don't have to do it on your own. I guess it's my last word. Anything, so I'm taking it away already, but maybe, Walid, you have something to say as well.
No, definitely. So it's like, we want all the members to be engaged. We want to be able to attract new members. And in these engagements with advocacy, actually, it is actually clear that the MPs, the MPPs, those senators that we talk with, they have more empathy if the person talking with them is a younger person. So we really want to get trainees, postdocs being involved in these engagements as well. So I would very much recommend people to get involved with CSMB and get involved with these activities as well.
Thanks, HJ. Thanks, Walid. I did see a question earlier, although I don't.
It was just a link, Kate, to oh, now we have a question. Question: how can we make investment in Tri-Council interesting to elected officials? Kate, do you want to start on that? I'm sure all 4 of us would have views on that, and I think it's at the heart of a lot of what we're trying to do. So I'll just turn it to you, Kate, and go from
Go ahead. I'll fill in any blanks.
Okay. So I think this is kind of a theme of what we were saying, right? Is that investing in the Tri-Council is important to us. How do we make it important to all kinds of decision makers? And so I'll just say a few things. We need to link it to what's important to them. So we need to tell the story about how innovation starts with academic research and maybe ends with innovation and companies growing, but that there's an important spectrum of research and development, and how investment in basic research improves innovation within an economy and productivity. Essentially, that there's a ROI on investment in the Tri-Council. I think then we also need to tell stories about how investment in research and innovation can improve the lives of Canadians, whether you can link that to discoveries or innovations made here on climate change, on health, things like that. So how does it improve the everyday lives of Canadians? Certainly COVID is an interesting story that we could get into around that. And I guess the third thing I would say is that particularly politicians tend to be people persons, not statistical persons. So the real challenge is that numbers can glaze people over. It's hard for people to contextualize numbers. It's easier to relate to a story about some of the really interesting research if I'm a member of parliament from Edmonton that's taking place at the University of Alberta, or if I'm a member of parliament in Winnipeg that's taking place at the University of Winnipeg or University of Manitoba, or if I'm a member of parliament from Halifax that's taking place at Dal, and linking it to the next generation, as HJ was saying, or Walid was saying, and sort of young researchers and the challenges they're having living below the poverty line. So it's personalizing the story, both from the people that conduct the research, as well as personalizing it in a way that's poignant for the person we're talking to, and then also playing into the themes that are important for our audience.
Very good.
So maybe can I add to this a little bit in terms of what we have learned in the past from conversations is that, and that's something that Walid mentioned earlier, is that often the officials do not understand how science works as an enterprise kind of thing. So what Don was saying is, like, he was identifying the end outputs that are valuable for the economy at that point in time, like, an invention at the end or something like that. But I think reiterating what the value chain is through the investments that are done by the Tri-Council funding agencies, which means, for instance, that whatever grant I'm going to get is not my personal salary, but it's actually jobs that I create in the lab, is something that often is not understood, right? Mm-hmm. But the argument about jobs is something that is understood, and that's where the details of how the money flows and how the value chain for that money is not clear. Or another example is, for instance, in terms of crisis preparedness, my lab works on nucleic acids and like on RNA. And when the whole thing with COVID happened, basically my lab was depleted by people that were going into companies to actually work on that because we were training them at that point in time already. So that's a value component to this that needs to be told as a story. So if that makes sense, so that they understand what the benefits of Tri-Council funding is, and that's not just paying for my Ferrari that I don't have outside, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can also add a bit to what AJ was saying. I think also relating things more personally. So if you are talking with a representative, one example you can provide, for example, we have students, we pay the students to say 30K a year over 5 years, that's 150K. But then, so you have a highly qualified person, and then if that person moves to the US, so 150K was actually public money. It's taxpayers' money to train this person, and then this person now goes to the US. So this is not a good business model. So we need to be able to have a good scientific enterprise in Canada so we can retain these people that we are training. So relating these personal anecdotes would really help when talking to these representatives. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. Oh, sorry, Kate, did you want to add something?
No, go ahead.
How would advocacy change from the perspective of a trainee versus PI? How would trainees go about advocating for their needs at the local and federal level? I mean, great question. This is a theme that Walid's raised. So Kate, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. I mean, so I do think it ties back into some of the things that we were saying earlier about grassroots engagement. I mean, on an individual level as a trainee, you have a postal code. So if you have a postal code, you have a representative in Ottawa, and you can decide to engage on that sort of person-to-person level with your local MP. Another option or another thing that you could do is, like HJ and Walid mentioned, is to get involved into what the CSMB Advocacy Committee is doing and share your stories there, so that the CSMB Advocacy Committee can also increase awareness around the particular stories that you have. I'll pass it over to HJ and Waleed from here. And Dawn, of course, if you have anything else to add.
I might have something that I could contribute to this, and that is about there are not enough scientists at any level in the government, basically, is what I heard recently quite frequently. And to the point that there are structures and funding schemes in place to attract more scientists or scientifically trained people into the government structures. So like fellowships and like, you know, working with federal bodies to actually learn how the processes are. So actually one of the requests is, if you are a trainee, consider policy and politics as a career path as well, because that takes that away. So, and we just learned at the CSPC that you can actually be involved in these kind of, so the Canadian Science Policy Center meeting in Ottawa earlier this year, that you can be part of these engagement process and become members of funding agencies and these kind of things. So it's a real career path that you can have, and that actually is an important way of shaping it, right?
Another great question here. Curious if you have ideas, recommendations when releasing articles like the one about graduate student funding above. The hope is that it could get as much visibility and serve as leverage for the funding advocacy effort. So yeah, like I have tons of ideas. I'm sure HJ, Waleed, and Kate do as well. We will quite often, if we know that an article or study is being released, and depending on resources, we would work with clients to develop a whole communication strategy around it that would include getting op-eds about the release, even potentially, if we think it's newsworthy enough, issuing a press release about it to encourage media coverage. I mean, politicians tend to be heavily focused on media as proxies for what their constituents think. There are media that cater directly to government audiences like the Hill Times and many other publications. We could organize events in Ottawa around the release of the study. You could do follow-up meetings with individual MPs to educate them about the study. So there's all kinds of direct and indirect ways to leverage these types of studies to highlight an important issue like graduate student funding. You could do social media strategies so that you could be paid or unpaid social media strategies. There's lots of ideas, and usually what you do is the person that's releasing it would plan these types of things to coincide with the release of the study, but it doesn't have to be that way. You know, you could do that after the study as a way of sort of increasing visibility, both through direct advocacy and what I would call indirect advocacy. Kate or HJ or Waleed?
I'll turn it to HJ and Waleed for anything else to add.
Yeah, I think Don mentioned all the different possibilities here, and maybe sending the article directly to your MP or MPP to highlight the issues that are being presented. But I know, for example, as well, that some professors at U of T, for example, try to submit opinion articles to Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail. It would be great, actually, if a trainee does that as well, not just coming from professors, because professors, of course, are trying to get money for their lab. But if it comes from a trainee, then it will definitely have further impact as well. Yeah.
And I'm definitely going to read the article in question and, you know, put some more thought into some ways to enhance visibility.
Another fantastic question. In your experience, what has been the biggest barrier faced by politicians to implementing the CSMB suggestions into policy changes? HJ, you want to start on that one?
That is an interesting question. So, I mean, we have done a lot of recommendations with respect to the funding increases and the graduate student funding aspects of it. And part of that is the challenge might be that it has to be socialized that we're not just simply asking for more money and more money again. In terms of like, you know, you don't want to create a situation where you sound like greedy and you want any more, like, because the government, if you ask this question, the government says, you know, we have invested into science enterprise like no other government before, period. Okay, so which is great and actually highlights the issue because they actually did that. But the way the funding was allocated is not, for instance, through the Tri-Council funding. So, which means as we are having these conversations, we learn that we have to fine-tune our narrative, our language around these kind of things, right? So in the current situation, there is investment in science, but it is channeled away from the Tri-Councils. And an example that I make for this, how this is a difficult situation is, for instance, right now, we're saying we want to increase the funding base for the graduate student scholarships, for instance, right? So the outcome out of that is that probably the value of the scholarships goes up by, let's say, 20%, 10%, whatever you're wishing for, right? But it will be in the scholarships. But how many of the graduate students that we actually have in our innovation enterprise are funded by those scholarships? I would say 10%. The rest of them are 90% are funded through the operating funds that come through for instance, through Tri-Council funding, which has still baseline funding. So not only do we not increase the funding to those, but we are also not increasing the value of, we cannot increase the values of the scholarships that way. So we're creating an uneven situation. So our narrative needs to be adjusting to that kind of reality and saying, you know, this is the role that these space funding like CHI and NSERC discovery grants play in the funding of graduate students. And that although we're increasing some funding, we are not hitting the whole graduate student population. So answering the question is, there's part that we need to learn as well on the as we are going and engaging with the government, how we fine-tune our narratives in terms of what we want to the government to implement. If that answers this question a little bit, so we learn as we go, I guess, right?
Yeah,
go ahead, Walid. I'm going to have to say my goodbyes. I have a hard stop at 3. I
Sure,
apologize.
sure.
I know
I guess
Kate
this might be
can
the
go.
last question here. Yeah, I mean, I can just add that from doing this in the last year or so, the biggest barrier seems to be that many politicians don't see the direct tangible outcome of putting money into science. They don't understand that science is a long-term game, that it's creating knowledge rather than curing someone of a disease the next day. So they don't have that understanding, and it's more of a public perception that we're putting money into science, but we're not getting anything back out of it. Like if you put money into creating a factory to make cars, it's clear, okay, you're gonna get cars out of the factory right away within a year or so. But they don't. So science is a much longer game, and that's what really needs to be conveyed: is that you have to put money into science. Eventually, it will give you a result. You might not see it now. You might see it 20 years down the road. But putting money now might prevent the next pandemic as well. So this is what has to be done, is some sort of an education that has to be done to show that science is very, very important, but it's not something that's going to give you a result right away. It's something that will be very important for you down the road.
Very good. I do see that we are at the top of the hour. If there are any more questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I'm happy to stick around for a couple more minutes. If there are no more questions, then do know that this presentation will be circulated afterwards, so you will have access to all of the content that was in this presentation. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Sorry, I don't know why music just started in here. But with that, I will say goodbye to everyone, and I wish you a very wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
You.
Thanks, Kate, for organizing.
Thank you, Kate, for organizing this, and you for being here. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.